Good evening. My name is Itzel Coron Aguilar, and I'm the instructor for Intro to Race, Gender, and Sexuality Studies. Thank you for joining me. When you are reviewing this PowerPoint, there's a few things that I want you to look at, and I also want you to keep in mind a few things for the course structure. So, what this audio visual clip is going to demonstrate for you is some of the key things that you should do when you're working on your Canvas page, as well as how to navigate the course. So if you have any questions or anything like that, please just feel free to send me an email. But I want to go ahead and get started. So I'm sure everybody has gotten a good review of the Canvas page online. But basically, this syllabus down here, I've actually updated it. And what I want you to keep in mind is that this schedule that I've broken down the readings in is the recommended schedule, and you do not have to follow it by any means. This is only what I recommend for you to follow so that you can keep on track of all the readings and submit your weekly responses on time. But each week, I've broken down the readings from on Tuesdays and Thursdays. So last week, January 19th, was our first day, and I had you just review the syllabus. The 21st was when your first introductory post was due. And on this week, January 26th, on Tuesday, yesterday, you were expected to review the following readings. And then for Thursday, those will be the readings that you have to do, and Friday, your response post is due. What I recommend is that you focus on the PowerPoint lectures and the readings on these days, Tuesdays and Thursdays. That way, Mondays and Wednesdays, you do the online work that is available on the modules tab, which I know many of you have already reviewed, but basically the section here, this page for week 2, for example, what you're going to do is what I recommend is that for those days, Mondays and Wednesdays, you really focus on this material here. This material is sort of a preface for how to think through the readings and more contemporary examples of how the work that we're engaging with can be related to current times and what's going on in these times. So I have broken down the course by Monday and Wednesday. You will focus on these questions here. I present a few questions for you that are not necessarily supposed to be answered like one question, here it is, two, here's the answer, but more just guiding questions for you to think through the material. And I will know that you answer this as long as you discuss what you've learned about the material. You'll be answering a lot of these questions already. So I think there's been a lot of questions about, do you focus on this content or do you focus on the readings, the external readings in your response post? And the answer is both. You should be integrating all of them. And I don't expect you to provide a summary of every single reading. What you can do is think about the major themes and concepts that the readings are referring to. So, how do various authors talk about gender and race? And that way, you talk about them simultaneously while not having to, you know, do a one by one summary. And this is a skill that you will develop as you continue with this course and over time. But one of the important things that I do ask is that you don't summarize the readings extensively, because I've read them and everybody in the class will have read them. So I want you to really engage with the readings critically. And that's why the major content or the major part of this class is just reading the material and writing about what you're learning from it and what you think about it. So those are the questions. For this week, you'll be watching a few videos from Tourmaline and different artists. This is a scholar by the name Ariana Brown who writes a lot about the ways in which anti-blackness exists in Mexico, and how there's a lot of efforts to erase Black people from Mexican history. So I want you to look at these videos, and in these videos, you're going to discuss a few of the questions that I propose here. And this is really to get you to start thinking about like race. A lot of people come into this class hoping to learn about feminism, gender oppression. But one of the things that I really want you to get out of this class is that any gender analytic has to have a race component always. That's very critical in understanding gender dynamics anytime, any place, whoever is involved. Race is always at the forefront. So this is why we're really getting into this. And I'm specifically focusing on Mexico and that geography and that history because of a lot of the feminist work that we engage in is Chicana feminism, US feminism, and it's important for us to know this history as well as learn what these writers are writing against. So that's one part. The other question that I've been receiving is a discussion post. So I want to be very clear here that each discussion post, for example, we're on week 2. This one will be due Friday at 5. Okay, and the reason I have on here that you're going to submit 12 discussion posts is because you will submit 12 discussion posts throughout the entire semester. So out of the 16 weeks, there's 12 discussion posts that you will be submitting. And this means that you have the option to either write an original discussion post from on the discussion board or a response to a peer. It's either or. It's not both. You can write both if you want, but it's not necessary. You can do one or the other. And the only thing that I ask is that you focus on the guided questions and discuss the readings, whichever option you choose. So if you write an original post, make sure you do all the questions, think about the readings, refer to the guide of all the things that you should identify when reading for this class because it will be very helpful for you. And then if you write a response post to a peer, you should definitely also be answering all the questions that are available on the pages for this week. So going down here, you're gonna see that I provide a brief breakdown of what you should be completing, but I also want to say that I'm very flexible, and if you feel like you want to write an essay, a less structured paragraph, but all of those options are fine as long as you do not submit bullet points or a list. You should be writing your work in a cohesive statement. It doesn't have to be an essay, but it should be a cohesive statement with some kind of argument. You're demonstrating that you're noticing these things. These readings speak to each other in a particular way, and that's why I present the guiding questions. So I mentioned here, please don't summarize. Also for citations, you can use in-text citations or you can use endnotes at the end of the, I prefer Chicago or MLA, but whichever one you want to do is fine as long as you stay consistent. Yes, the other thing I wanted to mention is if you, for some reason, don't get to access this discussion post in time or something happens to your work, please email me right away because as you read, I posted a resource called Frequently Asked Questions, and I want you to review all of that just so you have an understanding of the missing assignment policy and the extensions and how that works. But basically, given the pandemic conditions we are in, I am going to be understanding and work with you, but I also want you to know that this course will accumulate over time. So if you do not, keep up with your work, it will be very challenging for you to continue to understand the concepts we're engaging with. So I just really encourage all of you to really just try to follow the schedule as best as you can. And the lectures also are going to be posted. Are all of them for the rest of the semester have already been posted. So if you wanted to work ahead and write up all of your responses, you could definitely do that. Um, that's an option that I give to students because I know everybody works at different pace. If you need an extension, if you need more time, all you have to do is email me. But I, will have some limitations as to what I can and cannot do for students. Um, okay, so for the discussion post, that's about it. I do want to ask that you pay attention to the announcements page. I'll quickly talk about the midterm and the final and just say that it is not meant to be stressful in any way. It is both exams are an opportunity to just really demonstrate what you've learned in the class and how you're thinking through the readings. I will be able to gauge if you're reading the material by what writing you produce. So the midterm and the final will just be one or two questions asking you to think critically about the readings in a larger scale. And you'll be able to access the study guides that I've provided, the notes that you have, the PowerPoints. It's an open book exam, so you can use all of that. It's not really an exam, but I call it an exam just so you have an understanding that it will be happening in the midterm and end of the course. Um, so that is that. Let's see. If you have any other questions about your grades, anything like that, please feel free to let me know. I also have included extra credit opportunities, and I'm going to show you what those look like here. So I believe in week 5. Oh, here we go. So in certain pages each week, you'll see there's certain sections that include additional readings that say here, for example, suggested reading, the colonial harem. And what you should be able to do is you should be able to open this reading up, get access to it, review some of it as much as you can, write a one-page response, and submit it by Sunday of that week. So if this is week 5, you should be submitting it by that Sunday. After that, you cannot submit any extra credit work unless you've been sick or there's been some dire situation, something's going on that you need some flexibility around this. But for the most part, that's going to be the deadline, Sunday by 5 p.m. And it's a one-page double-spaced response. And each week you will see some things like this available. But that's as far as what you need to know for the course. I also want to state that my office hours are available Monday through Friday, really, as long as you contact me and let me know you need to schedule an appointment. I'm available. And I also will be hosting monthly like walk-in hours where I'll have a Zoom link available for anybody to just be able to jump in and meet with me to ask any questions that they might have. And those will be happening every month, every 3 weeks or so. So it's a little bit less than a month. But and other than those times, if you don't need that, you can also schedule an appointment anytime throughout the week, Monday through Friday. So that's all I have for the course structure. The Canvas page is pretty accessible and easy to navigate. You have the modules right here, which is what you really need to focus on. But I want to briefly talk about the lectures that I've posted and what you really need to sort of focus on when you're reviewing these PowerPoint slides, and what you should be thinking through when you're engaging with the readings. So, if uh, if you are taking this class to, a lot of you in your introductory post talked about wanting to be in this class to learn about different points of views, different perspectives, global understandings of internet intersectional feminism, want to understand current times. This class is a great step towards all of those goals, because what we're going to learn about is that feminism and the creation of gender studies as a discipline are two very different things. And you'll get an understanding as to why. So, one of the things that I start you off in this PowerPoint is to just think through what your current knowledge of feminism is. What are some common misconceptions that you might have about feminism? And what are some things that you've been exposed to or learned about? And a lot of the common misconceptions that I hear from students at time are that feminism is only about white women, which we often get a lot of imagery of, right, in movies and things like that. But this is a misconception, because we're going to learn in this course that a lot of the origins of these movements come from uh, women of color, queer of color, trans, non binary communities that were leading these movements way before this. So, this idea of feminism was recognized. Um, so we'll talk a little bit about Susan B. Anthony and Rosie the Riveter, these common imagery symbols that we see that identify what feminism looks like. Um, a lot of people think that feminism only pertains to women, or that it's only about equal rights or women's rights. But as I said before, and as we're going to learn in this course, um, current and more modern, radical, contemporary understandings of feminism have a much more broader broader goals in working not just towards gender liberation, but really thinking about how gender liberation is so intimately tied to uh, fighting racism, anti-blackness, and all these other forms of oppression that we're going to be learning about in this class. Um, the other thing is that a lot of people assume that feminists hate men, or that uh, we're separatist. And separatist really just means that there's this idea that feminists should have their own communities or be separated from men. And one critical thing that we'll be learning this semester is that current feminism really focuses on extending these categories of who is considered a woman, who is considered feminine. And we're going to learn so much about that. And I know that a lot of you had questions about that in your introductory post. So please feel free to email me. I encourage you to also reach out to your peers in the class. Maybe you have people that you see that have similar questions to you, and you can reach out to them and start conversations about it. Um, but there's also these ideas that, there's one definition of feminism, this is what it looks like, and everyone has to follow it, and that you have to follow certain rules or certain ideas to be considered a true feminist. And we're really going to sort of break all of those myths in this class throughout the semester. So last week you started to engage with a critical piece by Sojourner Truth, which is called "Ain't I a Woman?" And the important part of her work here and the contributions, and not just contributions, but really leading these initiatives, um, are the reason that I include her work as the first reading in the syllabus is because this is where we really have the rise of the Women's Rights Convention in 1851. So Sojourner Truth was a formerly enslaved woman who gave a speech in Akron, Ohio. And in this speech, which you have all read, she engaged in a presentation or speech that really challenged this idea of white femininity and white womanhood. And she questioned and added the racial analytic component of why feminism was being fought for during this time. And she questioned a lot of the intentions with that white women had during this time, because a lot of them hired the organizers of this movement at this time were responsible for what would be identified as tokenism, and really engaging in a violent act of representation or seeking representation by asking Sojourner Truth to present at this conference. And Ain't I a Woman, this piece is one of the earliest works that really deconstructed this idea of womanhood, and specifically this idea of womanhood as it relates to whiteness, and how this was the dominant discourse during this time. So she really questioned a lot of that work. And one of the reasons why this piece is so critical is because a lot of times feminist initiatives are portrayed as fighting for equality and prioritizing women's rights. But what we'll learn throughout this class is that these initiatives did not exist because of necessarily wanting to liberate women, but the reason this conference was organized in Ohio was because there was efforts currently going on during that time in 1851 to have to give access to voting rights to Black men. And this was seen as a radical idea for white women at the time. They were really against this and said that it was radical and ridiculous for Black men to be able to have access to a vote before white women could. So this is really what initiated the women's movement and the white women's movement, because that's really what a lot of feminist mainstream discourse presents, without really talking about the racial dynamics that were happening. And that's really what Sojourner Truth was getting at in her work. Um, so this is why I ask you to think about what was happening during this time and what were the settings. So this was what was happening. Like I mentioned, there were efforts to give access to voting rights to Black men, and the setting and the time period really played a critical role in white women trying to liberate themselves. And this is a common misconception that the women's movement grew out of the struggle for um, the abolition of slavery. A lot of times that's portrayed in a lot of movies and a lot of film and a lot of different representations and cultural representations of feminism. We see this idea of how white women were somehow joined or working alongside formerly enslaved communities, but this was not the case. And we're going to learn a lot about how that history and those legacies continue to shape the not just the idea of feminism as a cultural practice and thing that's commodified and you can engage in, but also as a discipline and practice, like what we're doing now of teaching and engaging with sort of analysis of gender. But those two are very different, and that's what I want you to think about in this class. There is the idea of feminism, which maybe some of you identify or have seen or would like to identify as. And then there's this other component that is about engaging in a sort of gender analytical framework. And maybe those are the same thing for you. Maybe they're different. That's really up to you, for you to think through. But for what I want you to think through, I do want you to sort of distinguish them a little bit. Um, and I think you'll understand why as we continue with the semester. So there's a few slides here on Andrea Smith's work that I actually did not post a reading on, but I removed it from the syllabus and I chose something else. But one thing that I did want to mention about her work and the sort of contributions that she had and the contributions that Native American feminism has had in the sort of broader discipline of gender studies is that a lot of things, a lot of the early symbolic imagery that was used by white women to create um, women leaders were from uh, cultural figures in indigenous communities. So, for example, I believe Susan B. Anthony was uh, co- constantly studying and researching about matriarchal or powerful women figures in indigenous communities to shape her own understandings of what that looked like and what fighting for women's liberation might look like. So she wrote a lot about that, but um, that essay is not on the syllabus. So if you would like to skip these slides, you definitely can. Um, this work by Audre Lorde is really to get you to think about these points of what is racism, what is sexism, and what is homophobia. And Audre Lorde talks about these three forces as working together to maintain oppression together all the time. So, for example, what I mean to clarify what I'm saying is that racism does never exist without sexism. Homophobia never exists without racism. They're always intimately tied. And these tools she identifies as the master's tools. And she states on page 25 in your reading, what does it mean when the tools of a racist patriarchy are used to examine the fruits of that same patriarchy? It means that only the most narrow parameters of change are possible and allowable. So she's really critiquing a lot of feminist organizers in this time, because we're going to talk a little bit about a timeline that was happening here. Let's see here. I'm going to move forward a little bit. Thought I saw it. Oh, here we go. So we're going to learn a little bit about this, but it's not something super critical that I think you need to memorize or anything like that. But the waves of feminism have really been broken down by four waves. The first wave would be the women's suffrage movement, which I described a little bit at the beginning of this lecture, which was Susan B. Anthony, these women in the 1850s who started the Declaration of Sentiments and who were also supporters and abolitionists like Frederick Douglass, Sojourner Truth, and this is what that era was about. In 1920s was when women's right to vote was secured, and we entered the second equal rights wave in the 1960s, when we have other civil rights initiatives happening and participation in social justice movements after World War II and the civil rights movement were taking place. Simone de Beauvoir was one of the critical feminist scholars that was well known internationally at this time. But we're going to see that a lot of the Black feminist scholarship and the Chicanx queer of color scholarship that originates, that we see today, is really happening because of the work that came around the 60s and 70s, with a lot of these civil rights initiatives happening. Because by the 1960s, there was a huge shift, I would say, between equal rights feminism and radical feminism. And there was a lot of debates between lesbian and women of color who felt the equal rights framework was not enough. And we're going to read a lot about that. For example, you read some of that in Audre Lorde's work, who writes a lot about her positionality as a lesbian. And this is really part of the wave that was happening at the time, 1970s, 1960s, and 1980s. And I'm sure many of you see now and have access to different social media accounts, etc., where you get access to people talking about gender and queerness in a much more expansive way. Um, it's not just limited to sexuality, as many of these scholars were relying on during that time. And that's really when you get into this third wave, this intersectional wave, where queer theory emerges, gender constructs become questioned, and centralizing identities outside of cisgender is continuously happening. And this idea of what it means to be a woman really becomes redefined. And then there are some conversations about a fourth wave, but there are a lot of different opinions about this. And I'd love to hear your thoughts, if you've heard about this, read about this, or do you think it's necessary to have waves? Is it helpful for you? One thing to think about is who gets to determine these breaks in history and who writes that history. Is something to think about. So here we read a little bit about these conversations that were happening, like I mentioned, during the 1970s and the 1980s. You're going to read a lot of letters that were written between women who were attending conferences and writing about their experiences, what it meant to really actually be in these spaces while writing about these larger questions about gender and race. Mm, One thing too that a lot of you talked about is the importance of having like a transnational global perspective of feminism, and that's something that we'll definitely be engaging with, and also thinking through in a lot of the suggested readings and video content that we look through, so please take a look at that. The next essays that you're going to be engaging with are from Kimberly Crenshaw's work. And this is a critical essay for you to think through because it's really getting at the intersections of race and gender. I'm sure many of you have heard about intersectionality, and I really want you to get through this reading. Watch the video where she talks about the importance of this critical framework during these times. And what does it mean to not have an intersectional framework? Um, the key component to Crenshaw's work and the theory of intersectionality is she emphasizes that when we prioritize the most privileged group members, the ones who are most marginalized are erased. This is apparent in the law particularly. So this is something and a concept that we're going to be working with throughout the semester. And it's really important that you watch this video, hear the urgency of intersectionality. She really does a fabulous lecture at breaking down what does this theory mean, what does it represent. Okay, so I think that's all that I have to really kind of briefly talk about with you. Just want to restate that a lot of these check ins are just brief overviews. This class is already so content heavy, and you're doing a lot of reading and a lot of work that I don't want for you to have to attend really long lectures. So please know that this is a very independent course. You have the flexibility to work through the readings and the writings on your own. As long as you contact me if you have any issues with the exam, any issues with the midterm, you should be fine. And if you have any questions about any of the material or the structure, I'm more than open to feedback and suggestions. And we'll continue to be reviewing a lot of the material together. So, any questions that you have, please feel free to email me. Thank you.